So welcome everyone to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts' February stated meeting. I am Bob Allison, the president of the Colonial Society, and I'm delighted to see so many people with us this afternoon for our program, which will feature Nancy Seasholes. And before we get to that, we do have a piece of business that is Susan Lively, our vice president and chair of the membership committee, will read the names of the members we will be voting on at our April stated meeting. So thank you, Susan Lively.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you to everyone who's attending today. I wanted to report that the following 7 people have been nominated for membership to the Colonial Society. These nominations have been approved by the nominating committee and by the council, and we'll be voting on these nominees at the next stated meeting. The 7 nominees are Richard Batchelder, nominated by Nat Scheidley and Martha McNamara; Lamershi Frazier, nominated by Bob Allison and Martha McNamara; Thomas Ham, nominated by John Tyler and Toby Hall; Gavin Cleespies, nominated by Bob Allison and Catherine Algor; Ashish Sadiq, nominated by Marla Miller and Bob Allison; Kenneth Torino, nominated by Bob Allison and Nina Zanieri; and Serena Zabin, nominated by Bob Allison and Hiller Zobel. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. So I'm really delighted to have a distinguished panel actually with us. We have Nancy Seasholes. Nancy was actually not a native New Englander. She was born in Chicago, but then she came to this area to go to college. She received her bachelor's degree from Radcliffe in history, and then got a master's in teaching from the Harvard Graduate School of Education before finding her true vocation, which is as an archaeologist. And she received a master's and a PhD in archaeology from Boston University. And her great book, well, her first great book, I should say, was Gaining Ground, A History of Land Making in Boston. And a year later, she published a walking tours of Boston's made land, 2 invaluable resources. And over the last decade, she has been working on a monumental book, the Boston Historical Atlas. And I'm happy to say that 9 of the contributors to the Atlas are members of the Colonial Society, and we actually have 2 of them with us on the panel. Robert Charles Anderson, a genealogist who is probably the foremost authority on Boston in the 1630s and 40s, on the Great Migration to Boston, and Mark Peterson, a professor from Yale University, whose most recent book is Boston as a City-State, the Rise and Fall of the City-State of Boston. And I think Mr. Anderson and Mr. Peterson will be commenting later on. Now I wanted to introduce Nancy Seasholes, who is going to lead us through the Historical Atlas of Boston. So thank you, Nancy.
Thanks, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here. So let's see if we can do the share screen correctly. All right. So as Bob told you, I am going to be talking about this new book, The Atlas of Boston History, which is an historical atlas of Boston. That is, it traces Boston's history through maps. In this case, maps that were drafted for it, especially by a team of cartographers. The maps in the atlas go from, why is it not advancing? Help. Okay, so how do I get my next slide? Stop share. We'll go back to this one and try again. All right, let's see if this works. This is the maps in the atlas go from this one. As you probably know, in an atlas, the maps are generally arranged in double-page spreads called plates. So this is the first plate, and it shows Boston, the Boston area at the time of the last ice age. This map, which was drafted by our cartographers, shows that Boston, which is right in here, is in a geological formation called the Boston Basin, which extends from Lynn on the north to Quincy on the south and Wellesley and Natick on the west. These different colors indicate that at the bottom of the Boston Basin are two different types of bedrock. In the northern part is a sedimentary shale called Cambridge argillite that looks like this. And in the southern part is a conglomerate. That's a rock that's composed of stones set in a matrix that's called Roxbury conglomerate, or it's sometimes called Roxbury pudding stone because the early settlers thought that the small stones in the rock looked like the plums in plum pudding. There actually are two different types of Roxbury pudding stone, which we illustrate here. At the end of the last ice age, the Boston Basin was completely covered with a thick sheet of ice, almost a mile thick. And that's what we're attempting to show here. This is a photograph of the Boston Basin taken from right up here in Belmont. And on that, we've superimposed what the depth of the ice would have been. 4,000 feet of ice, as I said, almost a mile thick. Then, about 23,000 years ago, that ice sheet began to melt. And as it melted, it left various layers of deposition in the Boston Basin, which we show here. So the plates in the atlas go from the last of the ice age to this one, which is the last plate in the atlas. It's about Boston in 2010, and it's the last of a number of plates we have in the atlas about Boston in a specific year. Our plates about Boston in a specific year generally show where people lived in that year. So that's what this map shows. Each one of these dots represents 50 people. The blue are whites, the yellow are blacks, the green are Hispanics, and the purple are Asians. And then down here, we have a graph that shows the distribution of these groups in Boston in 2010. Boston in 2010 was then, and still is, what's called a minority majority city, meaning the minority groups are in the majority, the blacks, the Asians, the Asians and blacks, Hispanics, and Asians. And as you can see, the whites are in a minority. Our plates about Boston in a specific year generally have a graph about population, showing Boston's population in relation to other large cities in the US. So here's that graph. Boston's this black line down here. In 2010, it was the 22nd largest city in the US. And this graph shows Boston's population from 1790 to the present, 1790 being the first federal census. As you can see, the population increased till about 1950 when it declined, and now it's rising again. Well, between the last ice age and the present, there are many plates in the atlas about many different topics, and I'm going to show you some of those today, particularly those about the colonial era. But you may be wondering, well, where did this project get started? Why is there this historical atlas of Boston? Well, frankly, it was my own idea. Even back in the 1990s, when we were working on mapping Boston, I kept saying, what we really need is an historical atlas of Boston. So when I finished that book about land making that Bob mentioned, and the related book of walking tours, I began to work on this historical atlas of Boston. I invited a group of historians who write on Boston history, and note that Bob was one of them, to meet to discuss this. They all thought this was a good idea, and we met, not all of us, all of the time, and we certainly didn't always meet regularly, but we met from 2007 to 2010 to decide what should be in the atlas. Finally, when we had the contents hammered out by 2010, we began to decide who was going to work on which plates. The members of the steering committee had expertise in a number of the topics we decided on, but not all. So we went looking for other authors, and we ended up with 35 different authors of the atlas, of which you can see Bob Allison is one, Bob Anderson, who's here with us today, is another. Kerima Lewis, who is to be one of the panelists, is another, and so is Mark Peterson. So the steering committee had decided that the atlas should try to tell the story of Boston's development from the end of the last ice age to the present, explaining how and why Boston has developed as it has. So the plates in the atlas are organized basically chronologically. They're divided into 11 sections. 4 of those sections really concern the colonial era. So I'm going to talk about the plates in those sections in some detail, but then I'll show you just briefly the rest of what's in the atlas. So the very first section is the one about the Boston area before Boston was founded in 1630. I've shown you this first plate about the end of the last ice age. So the second plate is about the Native American occupation of the Boston area before European settlement. Archaeologists divide this era into 3 periods. The first they call the Paleo-Indian period, which lasted from about 12,000 to 9,000, and BP means before present. That's before the present year. Or if it's easier for you to think about it that way, you could think of 10,000 to 7,000 BC. These are where some Paleo-Indian sites have been found, but Boston is right in here, if that's helpful. But the map also shows an interesting feature, and that is that the sea level was much lower at this time than it is now. When the glaciers were covering the Boston Basin, the sea level was also much lower because so much water was locked up in the ice sheets. But as the glaciers began to melt, the sea level began to rise. But at the same time, the land, which had been depressed from the weight of the glacier, began to rebound. And for quite a while, the rate of rebound was much faster than the rate of sea level rise. So that by 12,000 years ago, the sea level was much lower than it is now. So there probably are a lot of Paleo-Indian sites in this area right here, but we'll never know because they're drowned. These drawings here, by the way, show how the Native Americans lived during these different periods. The second period, archaeologists call the Archaic. More sites have been found, and the rebound of the land really had stopped, or at least was not, had slowed down greatly by about 12,000 years ago. So by then, the sea level was rising much faster, as you can see. And then the last period, which is called the Woodland, the sea level has risen almost to the present, which is shown in the dark green. The Woodland period was when Native Americans were by then practicing agriculture and raising crops like corn and squash, particularly on the harbor islands. On this side of the plate, Joe Bagley, the author, who's the city archaeologist, wanted to show where various natural resources in the Boston area were located. These were the things that attracted Native Americans to the Boston area. Our next plate is about European exploration and settlement in the Massachusetts Bay Area before Boston was founded in 1630. So one of the earliest of these European explorers was Verrazzano. This is basically where he, oh, come on, my trusty arrow froze, sailed in 1524. But the only ones who probably came into Boston Bay were Champlain in 1605 and John Smith in 1614. The map also shows the locations of those European settlements that preceded Boston: Plymouth in 1620, several on the North Shore by groups that were related to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, or forerunners of it, and then some in the 1620s by either individuals or small groups around Boston Bay. Our next section is about Boston in the 1600s. The first plate is Bob Anderson's plate on Boston between 1630 and 1640, the period that we call the Great Migration. So the map shows the location of those settlers in Boston in those years whose origins in England could be identified, about a third of them. And as you can see, they predominantly came from Eastern England, a section that we call East Anglia, and from London. This is an enlargement of this area right here. So a large number also came from London. This graph right here shows the great increase in immigration in New England during the Great Migration, and then its precipitous decline in 1640 when the Great Migration ended with the beginning of the English Civil War. This graph shows the increase in population of Boston and the Massachusetts Bay Colony as a whole during the Great Migration. And this map, which Bob worked on a long time, is something of a coup, and I think it's wonderful. There's nothing else like it. It shows the boundaries of the towns in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1640, superimposed on a modern map of town boundaries so that you can see what towns were set off from the original towns. So you can see, for example, that Boston originally included what is today Brookline, Winthrop, Chelsea, and Revere. And I was particularly interested to see the Dedham Grant and the Dorchester Grant. I knew that both of these were big grants, but I had no idea that they extended all the way down to the border of today's Rhode Island, or that the southern boundary of the Dorchester Grant was Plymouth Colony, what's today the line of Plymouth County. The next plate is by Mark Peterson, and Mark, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask if you have comments when I finish what I was going to say, because I know you have to leave before we'll probably get to the question period at the end. So this is explaining the economy of Boston in the 1640s. As Mark points out, during the Great Migration, Boston did pretty well. All of these settlers flooding into the Massachusetts Bay Colony, many of them had sold their property in England, and so they came with money that could be used to buy goods from England, which were needed, and also because there were so many immigrants arriving who needed food, the price of foodstuffs from Massachusetts farms was quite high. But with the end of the Great Migration, Boston really suffered. No more money was coming into the colony, so no English ships were coming to sell goods because no one was buying any. The price of food dropped. Boston really needed to do something to support itself. So it began exporting salted cod to Spain, particularly to Bilbao. Salted cod was always in demand by Catholic Europe. And here is the sacred cod, which, because it was so important in the early Boston economy, this is what hangs in the State House today. The Boston ships sold the cod in Spain and exchanged it for merino wool, which the Spanish raised, which was in great demand by the English textile industry. So they took the wool to England, exchanged it there, and then with the money earned, bought manufactured goods which were bought back to Boston. This was an early form of a triangle trade. But perhaps more important at this time was the beginning of Boston's trade with the Caribbean. This was the period when the big sugar plantations were being established on Caribbean islands. And the sugar planters didn't want to devote any land to raising foodstuffs. They just wanted to plant it all in sugarcane. So they imported a lot of their provisions, their livestock, and timber to build their houses. And Boston ships brought a lot of this to the Caribbean. On this side, Marcus used a 1702 map to show the effect of the Great Migration on New England as a whole. So many settlers came, they didn't settle just in Massachusetts, whose early boundaries you can see right here, but they established settlements throughout New England, along the Connecticut River, along the coast of what became Connecticut and Rhode Island, and New Hampshire and Maine. And some of the important settlements we've highlighted here in yellow. Comments, Mark?
I couldn't have done it better myself, Nancy.
What you wrote is a lot better than what I said.
Well, it's all there in your presentation. And I guess my only comment is the general point that sometimes to see what's going on in a place like Boston, even geographically, you have to get outside of it. And hence these occasional larger scale, wider scope maps seem to me to be part of the way that you tell this story.
Thank you. Well, our next plate is about accommodations with the Native Americans after Boston was founded. The early leaders realized they needed to be making some accommodations with Native Americans, but most of the colonists were really interested in Christianizing the Indians. This is the title page of the Bible, translated into the Massachusetts language by John Eliot, who also founded what were called praying towns. That's what's shown with all these crosses here, which were places where Indians settled and were meant to be converted to Christianity. All these efforts to Christianize the Indians really blew up in the 1670s when, because of resentment about this, the Native Americans revolted and began King Philip's War. The map shows some of the important battles of King Philip's War, but it was disastrous for the Native Americans. They were really decimated as a result of the war. And after that time, there really were not many Native Americans with whom to work out an accommodation. The next plate is another one about Boston in a particular year. 1676 was chosen because there's a very good reconstructed map of Boston in 1676 by Samuel Clough. Clough was a draftsman for Boston Edison in the early years of the 20th century, but his hobby was researching every property holding in Boston from 1630 to 1798 and then mapping them. His maps are a real treasure and they're kept at the Mass Historical Society. So for people who have trouble relating a map like this to the Boston of today, we provide a locator map. So here you can see the Clough map on a modern map of Boston. Our maps about Boston in a particular year, as I said, about the one in 2010, one of the things we wanted to do was show where people lived. So the Clough map, the property lines and the property holders' names are accurate, but the location of the houses is somewhat conjectural. The property boundaries and property owners' names are based on deed research, but the deeds don't generally say, although they say whether a lot had a house, they don't say where on the lot the house was located. Clough tended to put them all along the streets, and which was probably a very reasonable decision. So you can see from his map, settlement was in the North End. In this central area here, this is what became State Street. This is what became Washington Street. And the settlement was all along that street going out to the neck. We also wanted to show the location of public buildings, shown here in orange in the central area. Churches, which are shown in red. At this time, there were 3, all congregational. We showed taverns in pink, mostly in the central area, but some here in the North End, located to important sites of industries. And we wanted to show retail shops. I did this by comparing the names of property owners on the Clough map with the names in the Twing file at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And for those that I could find, identify in both places, and identify in the twing file those who had shops. We showed those shops and indicated what kinds of things they carried. I'm sure there were many more shops than these, but these were the only ones we could identify definitely. So they tended to be along the street going out to the neck. That's what became Washington Street and Union Street. We also show industries, which were located primarily along the waterfront. Shipbuilding was very important, as were related industries such as cooperage, rope walks. And our plates about Boston in a specific year generally include what we call an architectural sidebar. That is about the predominant style of architecture at that time. In this case, first period architecture. So we generally illustrate a public building. This is the townhouse, which was located right here at the head of State Street, where the old State House is today. In fact, it was its predecessor. This drawing is based on published specifications of what the building was like. The only first period house left in Boston today is the Revere House. So that's what we've illustrated. And we provide a floor plan so that people can see how people lived in that house. Our next section is about Boston in the 1700s. It begins with another plate on the economy by Mark. By this time, this is the 1740 to 1760, Boston's trade with the Caribbean was very important. Boston it was still a provision trade. Boston would take, again, provisions, livestock, timber to the Caribbean and bring back sugar and molasses, which would be distilled in Boston into rum. Rum distilling was a major industry in 18th century Boston. Then Boston would often take the rum to, one of the places was to West Africa, where it would be exchanged for slaves, which would be brought back to the Caribbean and then exchanged for more sugar and molasses and brought to Boston to be distilled into more rum. This is the notorious triangle trade that you often hear about. But it certainly wasn't the only trade that Boston participated in. Boston also participated in a very active trade with a number of ports in Europe. Mark didn't want to show trade routes because his point was that this was really an opportunistic trade. Boston sea captains would sell their cargoes wherever they could. Then often, with the money earned, they would buy manufactured goods in England and bring them back to the colonies, and often then trade them with other colonies. Boston was an entrepot for bringing imported manufactured goods from Europe to the British North American colonies. This down here is a fanciful drawing of Boston in the 1770s by a German artist. Boston was such an important port that Europeans imagined that it looked like European ports. That is, it was a walled city like them. It really wasn't, but the point of this is to show how important Boston was in European minds. Now, Mark, that's what I had planned to say. I didn't feel I had time to get into the Acadian issue, but you're welcome to talk about it if you would like.
Well, thank you, Nancy. I'll just say a couple of words, which is that that map, the one in the upper left, is...
Uh-oh, you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, how Boston's world of trade also entangled it in all kinds of other relations, especially after 1740, in the imperial ambitions of Britain more generally. And so, for decades before the 1750, Boston merchants had a very vigorous trade with the French-speaking colonists in Acadia and Nova Scotia, which was a British colony after 1710, but even with the French colonists in New France and Canada, illegal as that trade may have been. And so then when in the 1750s, as part of the 7 Years' War, the British military command decides to invade and deport the Acadians, the effect is that Bostonians are recruited into that effort, play a major role in the military efforts, and Boston merchants like Thomas Hancock, for instance, are the suppliers of the ships that deport the Acadians from Nova Scotia, and thousands of them end up strewn across the New England countryside. And that map shows all of the different places in New England where Acadian refugees, deportees, ended up. And so that map is there in a sense to sort of flesh out the range of effects that Boston's commercial world had on the wider social life of New England.
Thank you. Much better than my previous attempts, which is I had abandoned. Thank you. The next plate is also by Mark and Kerima Lewis about the slave trade. The first slaves came to Boston in 1638 from the Caribbean, but most of the slaves, and that is how most slaves came to Boston, either from the Caribbean or from southern colonial ports. As you can see, they were the ones that were really active in the slave trade. You can see that just by the size of these circles, particularly Charleston. Although the map on this side does show the routes of slaves that were imported directly into New England. By 1750, there were about 1,500 slaves in Boston. That was about 1/10 of the population. There wasn't a central slave market. Slaves were bought and sold by their owners through newspaper ads. And these are an illustration of some of those. This sidebar is about Phyllis Wheatley, who came as a young girl on a ship called the Phyllis, hence her name. She was bought by the Wheatley family, who taught her to read and write. And then when Phyllis was in her early 20s, she began to publish poetry, becoming the first published Black author in the country. Mark, would you like to add something?
Two things. One, actually, Phyllis Wheatley was even younger than that when she began publishing. She was a teenager when she started having her poems published. No, it was just remarkable talent. And there's a way in which the map of those routes is a little bit deceptive in that it was a rare thing for a slave trading ship to go directly from West Africa to Boston. And in fact, Phyllis Wheatley was unusual in being on one of those ships, since the great bulk of them went first to the Caribbean, then after that to southern ports, and then finally ending up in Boston. But of those that we know did go from West Africa directly to Boston, the map does show those origins.
Thank you.
Yep.
So our next plate is about, again, about Boston in a specific year, this 1743, which we chose because there's a very good 1743 map of Boston. This is the update by William Price of the 1722 Bonner map. So again, we wanted to show where people lived. As you probably know, on the Bonner map, the Bonner convention was he showed little houses along the streets. But when Price updated it for streets that were settled after 1722, he simply just used shading along the streets. We again showed churches in red, and this time we indicate their denominations because by this time there was a variety. Public buildings are in the central area in yellow, including the newly completed Faneuil Hall, which is right there. We did not show retail shops on this map. Ben Carp, who did it, felt that the way to access that information would have been through newspaper ads, and it was really just beyond the scope of the atlas. But we do show industries. Shipbuilding was very important, shown in the light blue, and rum distilling in purple, which you can see here and here. I should have said also with shipbuilding, there were related industries such as rope walks. It just so happens that there's a 1743 view of Boston. So this is what this map would have looked like seen from the water. All of these features were numbered on the view. So we numbered those very same features with the same numbers here where they're labeled. So by comparing the same numbers here and here, you can actually identify what all these features were by reading their labels on the map. As I mentioned, our plates about Boston in a specific year generally have a graph showing Boston's population in relation to, well, here it's other large towns in the British American colonies. Boston is black. You can see it was the most populous town in the British colonies until about 1740. And then it was overtaken first by Philadelphia and then by New York. And our architectural sidebar is about Georgian architecture. The public building we illustrate is the old State House. You may say, well, this doesn't look like the old State House. Where are the lion and the unicorn? Well, you have to remember there was a serious fire in the old State House in 1747-48. This is the way the old State House looked in 1743. It was built in 1713 with a gambrel roof, a balustrade, and an octagonal cupola. The gable roof that's there now, the lion and the unicorn, removing this door, all of that were things that were done when it was rebuilt after the 1748 fire. For an upper class house, we've used the Shirley Eustace House in Roxbury. We really tried to stick to houses in Boston, but there are no upper class Georgian houses left in Boston. So we went to Roxbury to the Shirley Eustace House, but the middle class house was and still is very definitely in Boston. It's the Clough House in the North End, but it too doesn't look like this now. Now it's a 3-story house with a gable roof, but originally it was 2 stories with a gambrel roof, as you can see. And again, we've included a floor plan so that you can see how people lived at the time. And then the last plate in this section is by John Bell, Boston 1775 blog you might know. I should comment, by the way, on the number of historical maps I've shown. You know, I said the maps were drafted by our cartographers, and most of them were, but we do use some historical maps, and I must say the colonial period has a disproportionate share of them. So what John wanted to show here was important revolutionary sites in Boston. They're identified down here. Those in bold still exist. The illustrations are of places that no longer exist or were greatly altered, like Faneuil Hall. This is the way Faneuil Hall looked when it was built in 1742. It's just 2 stories high with the cupola in the center. As you probably know, it was greatly enlarged in 1805 by Charles Bulfinch, who doubled the width and added a 3rd story. On this side of the plate, John is showing the events of April 18th, 19th, 1775. So here we have the riders who went to warn the residents of Concord that the British were coming. Remember, the British were going to try to capture some munitions in Concord. So this is the route of William Dawes, who left Boston by going down the road over the neck. And this is the route of Paul Revere. And as you remember, after they warned Lexington, Revere was captured by the British. Dawes lost his horse, but Dr. Prescott got through and warned them in Concord. This is the route of the British. You remember Paul Revere was up here looking for the signal from Old North Church. 1 if by land, that meant were the British going to take this route down the neck, or 2 if by sea, which is what they did, which meant that they left in small boats from the base of the Common, crossed the Charles River estuary to Lechmere Point in Cambridge, and then marched down basically what's today's Mass Ave from there. Down here, we see the British retreat from Concord. So This is the route of the relief column that came to meet the troops in Lexington, and then some of the confrontations, battles on their way back to safety in Charlestown. Our next section, and the last one that really includes any plates about the colonial era, is about Boston, the history of Boston from the end of the Revolution to 1828. But I understand your cutoff date is 1815, so I'll try to stop there. The first plate is by Dick Garver, who worked for the BRA, and it's about the economy from the end of the Revolution to the embargo of 1807. Boston had a very tough time after the end of the Revolution. They could no longer trade with members of the British Commonwealth, particularly not with the Caribbean, and Boston suffered serious depressions. But about 1790, the economy began to revive. One of the reasons was that Boston established a trade with Asia. Boston ships would take goods like cloth, beads, metal tools around Cape Horn to the Pacific Northwest, and then trade those goods there with the Native Americans, who are shown in this drawing here, for sea otter furs. They would then take the sea otter furs to China, where they would trade them for tea, silks, and porcelain. Now on this map, exports are shown in blue and imports in red. So they would import the Chinese goods, the tea, porcelains, and silks, around the Cape of Good Hope, circumnavigating the globe, and bring them back to Boston. This was the famous China trade, and it was very lucrative for merchants who participated in it. Probably more important to Boston at this time, however, was its trade with Europe. The 1790s was a period when Britain and France were engaged in an undeclared war and were dependent on neutral countries, particularly the US, to bring their goods from their colonies. So Boston's trade with Europe was very important at this time. Well, all of this new shipping resulted in the establishment of insurance companies to insure all these cargoes, and banks to finance them. And all the new insurance companies and banks were located along State Street in Boston, which is what we show here. This is the graph of population, which really belongs with the next plate, but there wasn't room for it. So we've shown it here. Here's Boston again with the black line. So Boston's population declined drastically during the Revolution because so many townspeople fled during the British occupation. But after the British left Boston in 1776, the people came back to the town, and the population then almost doubled between 1780 and 1810. And by 1810, Boston was the fourth largest town in the country after New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. So this is the plate that I've referred to. It's another one about Boston in a specific year. And yes, yet another historical map. This is the Carlton 1800 map of Boston, and here's the locator map to help you relate it to present Boston. Gail Sawtelle, the author of this plate, did a very good job of taking data from the 1800 Boston directories, the 1800 tax-taking books, and the property owners identified on the Clough maps for 1798 to identify various groups living in Boston and where their residences were. She then mapped where the elites lived in Boston in 1800. In the 18th century, they had really been clustered in the North End. But she found that by this time, there were certainly concentrations in the Bowdoin Square area, in Bullfinch's Tontine Crescent, that's where Franklin Street is today. This is what it looked like, and other places in the Old South End, and also in the central area. Her research confirmed that there was a large enclave of Black residences on the north slope of Beacon Hill. This is Cambridge Street. This is what became Revere Street, and the blue dots are Black residences. So you can see this large concentration there. Another group that she found, another group that she found that were significant were house rights, master builders. And they're shown with the green dots. And she found that they tended to concentrate in areas of new housing, which are shown by the dark green houses. So her point was that residential segregation was really beginning in this period. Her dissertation had also shown that retail shops were more specialized in this period than people had realized. And she maps the West India stores, those that carried goods from West India like rum and sugar, lemons. There was a concentration, they're shown with the pink dots, on Long Wharf and at the entrances to the town, which there's one along Cambridge Street. Cambridge Street had become an entrance in 1793 with the completion of the West Boston Bridge to Cambridge. That was a forerunner of today's Longfellow Bridge. And then there's another concentration of these West India stores along the street, the Neck, what became Washington Street. She also mapped industries. By this time, shipbuilding and rum distilling were not as important, but things like lumber yards were, because, as we've said, this was a period when Boston was growing very rapidly. The architectural sidebar here is about federal architecture. The public building is Bulfinch's new State House, which had opened in 1798 on the south slope of Beacon Hill. The upper class house we illustrate is the first Harrison Gray Otis house, which is still standing here on Cambridge Street in the West End. And the middle class house is also still standing. It's a frame house on 3 Smith Court on the north slope of Beacon Hill. It's called the Nell House. And then this is the last plate that really concerns the colonial era in Boston. The map shows early bridges that were built to connect the peninsula to the mainland, which, because the peninsula up until then had just been connected only by this one road down the Neck. The first of these bridges was the Charles River Bridge in 1786. This is where the West Boston Bridge, now the Longfellow Bridge, to Cambridge was in 1793. And then it shows other early bridges and either the bridges or the streets that they have become now. On this map, you can see that these bridges connected to turnpikes on the mainland. This was the big era of turnpike building nationally. And we also indicate these are all now major highways or streets. Back to this map, these different colors show new land that has been added to Boston. This was really the period when what I call all this filling or land making really began in Boston. As we've said, Boston's population was increasing very rapidly in the early 1800s, and the original peninsula was almost built up. Boston needed more space. They never considered expanding to the mainland in this period. In the first place, these were separate towns. And in the second place, the economy was really centered around the wharves in the central waterfront. So Bostonian solution to this need for more land was to make it by filling in the tidal flats that surrounded the original peninsula. Where did they get the idea that they could make land by filling in tidal flats? Well, as far as I can tell, it was from the methods that they used to build wharves at the time. Wharves in about 1800 were built by building a stone seawall around the outer perimeter of a wharf, dumping infill behind it, and then driving pilings into the fill, and building the wharf buildings on those pilings. And the same method was used for land making. They would build a structure usually a stone seawall, around the outer perimeter of an area to be filled, and then dump in fill behind it until the fill was above the level of the high tide. So this was really the beginning of some major land making projects in Boston. Some of the early ones were quite large. This was 43 acres. These different colors just represent different reasons for which the land was made. So as I said, that brings us up to about 1815. But I just wanted to show you quickly what's in the rest of the atlas. So our next section we call the Athens of America. It's really about the cultural importance of Boston in the early 19th century. And it includes this plate on the abolitionist movement. These are early abolitionists, important people in that movement. The map shows either where they lived or some important events in the abolitionist movement. And this blue line snaking through the map is the route of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, which, as you know, was the first African-American regiment in the Civil War, as they paraded through Boston in 1863 on their way before they disembarked to go and fight in the South. The next section we call immigration and industrialization. It's really about the history of Boston in the middle of the 19th century and includes this plate on Irish immigration. The map shows those counties in Ireland from which most of the Boston Irish came, at least up until 1857, particularly, as you can see, from most in the western part of Ireland, particularly County Cork. This shows where the Irish settled in Boston. They were most densely located in the ward that included what was then called Fort Hill. That's where International Place is today. This map shows mortality. The highest mortality was in the ward that included the North End, but it was also quite high in the wards that had Irish. And this map shows the number of people per house, which was highest in the wards that had Irish immigrants living in them. The next section we call Metropolitan Boston. It's really about the expansion of Boston from that small peninsula, basically to the boundaries of the city of today, from the annexation movement. And it includes this plate about the development of the public transportation system. These maps show the great expansion of the streetcars system from the horse cars, which began in 1856, to 1888, and then the huge expansion of the streetcar system beginning in 1888 when it began to be electrified. This map shows the early subway system, which we, excuse me, colored as they are now, just so you can see the forerunners of today's lines. Our next section we called Boston in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We tried to avoid the term century in the atlas. You know, it's really confusing to people. You say 17th century, but you mean 1600. So as much as possible, we tried to use the term hundreds, but it sometimes ended us up in awkwardnesses like this. I think this would have sounded a lot better if we could have said Boston in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Anyway, there are plates on a number of different topics, including this one by Susan Wilson on women's enterprises. It includes some famous women like Isabella Stewart Gardner and Fanny Farmer, and some not so famous like Doctors Marie Zakshevska and Susan Dimmock, who started a hospital for women that's now the basis of today's Dimmock Center. And this is Julia Paget, who ran the Swan Boat concession after her husband died just a year after it started. And in fact, the Paget family still run the Swan Boats. Our next section we call Decline. Boston had an unusually long period of depression. It began before the National Depression, which, as you know, began in 1929 and lasted much longer. The National Depression ended, well, in the 1930s, or maybe not till World War II, depending on how you look at it. But Boston's was much longer and created a great, had a great effect on the city, which we talk about in this section. Then we have a section on the revival after 1960 that includes this plate on the development of the highway system and the airport. As early as 1909, just when the automobile was just getting developed, it was recommended that Boston's highways be a system of radials coming out from the center, connected by circumferentials. And that's exactly what happened. This shows the dates of some of the important radials and the dates in the various sections of 128, which was probably the first and probably the most important of these circumferentials were built. And these colors show the different years in which the different sections of the airport were filled. As I'm sure you know, the airport is almost completely on man-made land. Only these two islands are original. This is a photo of the airport in 1923, the year it opened. You can see the original T-shaped runway. So what we're looking at is just this yellow section right down here. And then finally, we have the last section, which is about the present Boston. It includes some plates on updating the infrastructure. These are all, there are earlier plates on all these topics. 4 plates on the basis of the present economy, a plate on environmental problems, and then the one I showed you on Boston in 2010. So I hope I've given you some sense of what's in the atlas, particularly about the colonial era, and I would be delighted to answer any questions. Or maybe Mark and Bob have other things they want to say, both Bobs.
Well, before that, people can type in questions into the Q&A or into the chat. A number of people already have. So please do that if you have questions for Nancy or for one of the panelists.
Oh, Mark has to leave in about 2 minutes. So
Actually, I arranged another 15, so I can be here for a little while.
Oh, I should have, okay.
Nope, that's fine.
Bob Anderson, do you have any
Yeah,
comments?
I'd like to jump in here.
Do you want me to show your plate again?
Yes, please do. But I've got a couple of quick comments on a couple of the plates that you talked about. With the map of Boston in 1800, you showed the concentration of the Black residents on the north slope of Beacon Hill. And that reminded me, my Swedish grandfather, who came over about 1891, secured employment with one of the wealthy inhabitants of the south slope of Beacon Hill, but he had to live on the north slope. And so that was, at least in the late 19th century, was still a place to sequester the non-Anglos or whatever population was on the downside at the time. He eventually, that wealthy merchant eventually bought a summer house out in Harvard, Massachusetts. And so Emil Anderson got to go out there most of the time. On Mark's plate of that showed the Acadians being brought into Massachusetts at the end of the 7 Years' War. Again, an ancestor of mine left at the time those Acadians were coming in. The new English governor of Nova Scotia was looking for people to fill the spots that the Acadians had left open. And so one of my ancestors left Stoughton, Massachusetts, and settled in 1760 in Onslow, Nova Scotia. And he became part of a group that tried to bring Nova Scotia in as the 14th rebellious colony, obviously failed. And those people were the reverse of the loyalists. Those people known as the refugees from Canada and Nova Scotia. And they all ended up back in New England, and they ended up with a grant of land out in Ohio called the refugee tracts, with a very small group, but the opposite of the loyalists. And then finally, with respect to the plate that you and I worked on, Nancy, I wanted to talk a little bit about.
Oh, wait, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Just a minute, I'm getting there.
Already.
There. Right.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we did that map of 60 and 40 on the right. And the way I approached it, at least, was to try to find some anchors that we could build on And one of them that surprised me when I should have known it, but it surprised me down in the bottom of the South Shore in Weymouth. When I got a map of that, I realized that I think Weymouth may be the only town of all these 1630s towns that never changed its boundary a bit, wedged in there between Hingham and Braintree and Plymouth Colony. It has exactly the same boundaries that it had from its day one. So that was one anchor. And then in Purley's History of Salem, I found an outline map that Purley, or someone he had commissioned, had created with the outlines of the early Essex County towns, which made our job much easier there on the North Shore. Our trouble was in the center, of course, and I relied on Nancy's expertise right in the center around Boston. And so some of the hardest work that she and I had to do was on that periphery from the northwest to the southwest around Boston. And I'll just mention a couple. One of the ones we had fun with was Medford. Because Medford wasn't really a town as the others were. It was Matthew Craddock's farm. It was a private plantation in the midst of these incorporated towns. And yet it paid taxes, but it didn't have any representatives at the general court. And we found a description of it, how it's wedged in there in the middle of Charlestown and so on. It was very small, if we have it right. And then Nancy commented on the size of Dedham and Dorchester. And to me, that's kind of I think that's a placeholder. We couldn't find a description of the original boundaries of Dedham and Dorchester, but on the other hand, all of those towns that are outlined were when they were founded as if they were set off from Dedham and Dorchester.
We finally did get a map of the original Dedham grant. Remember, from the Dedham Historical Society.
Okay, right.
It was extremely useful. Yes, we were desperate.
Yeah, but anyway, that was great fun, and that really does give a different view of the place and tells you what things were like for the earliest settlers as they were soon after this settling many more towns further to the west. Oh, one more thing, if I could say, the heat map on the left of the origins of the immigrants from England. Obviously, the two biggest contingents were those who came in with Winthrop himself, and so mostly from Essex and Suffolk, since he came he and his wives were from those two counties, and he recruited heavily there. But at the same time, then you had those from Lincolnshire who came in before and then with John Cotton some years later. And so that's why those are the strongest. But you'll see in the dead center of the map, there's a sort of an orangish area for Northamptonshire, just below. And there's a very interesting point that I think will lead to some new history of Boston eventually. That orange blotch represents a man named Thomas Oliver and about 5 other families who came with him in 1632 to 1635. And the interesting thing is that when the Boston church was split up between Boston and Charlestown, they lost all the ruling elders. Increased Noel went back to Charlestown, was with the church there. So when they had to appoint a new ruling elder, the leading layman in the church in 1632, they didn't pick one of the Winthrop group, they didn't pick one of the Cotton group. They picked this Thomas Oliver, who came from Northamptonshire. Now he was in a parish in Northamptonshire where the minister was a man who had been one of the leading, most flaming radical separatists of Queen Elizabeth's reign, but he was convinced to conform and came to this little parish in Northamptonshire and then got into an argument with this Thomas Oliver and all of his friends. There were 2 different strains of Puritanism fighting each other in this little town in Northamptonshire in the 1620s. And Thomas Oliver brought his faction to Boston in the early 1630s. And he must have been well known to the others because, as I say, he was immediately made the ruling elder of Boston Church. So I think there's a story there that's yet to be told that feeds into the early history of Boston Church and of Boston altogether.
Thank you. Mark, do you have any final comments before you have to run?
Well, just 2 things. There's a lot of great stuff in the questions that people have typed in. I love Bob Gross's idea of a plate on crime and punishment in Boston. Maybe for the revised edition, Nancy, we could do that. That would be very interesting. And I just want to say, I think on behalf of all of the plate authors, what a pleasure it was working with Nancy on this, who was the great, creative genius and herder of cats, right? There's nothing harder than getting, 50 different academics on the same page at the same time. And so kudos to Nancy for pulling off this really tremendously wonderful piece of work.
Well, you were a pleasure to work with too. Believe me. You got your things in on time.
Okay.
Thank you, Mark. Now, as Mark said, there are a lot of really good questions. Let me just share some of them. This is a good one for Nancy. Steve Bortnick asks about landfill. When you filled in an area like around a wharf, did they take the walls out, or did the water flow back into the area where the wharf was built? It's something I've always wondered about.
No, I think they just filled in around the existing wharf. In fact, when they did the big dig, they just went through one wharf after another. They're all down there, or they were.
Wow. Well, and then that relates to Claire Carlson's question. Can you comment on how archaeological data helped inform the atlas?
Depending on the plate, I would say certainly for the plate that I showed you about Native American occupation, that's mostly based on archaeological data. Not so much for many of the others, other than the information I got when I was working on the land making book. Some of that was archaeological.
Yeah. And let's see, Mike Bavaro wants to know about maps showing residential housing of Roxbury during the time of the Revolution. Do you know of any?
I'm thinking, no. There is the state 1794 series, but it was not required to show residences. It was only required to show the town center, major roads, the boundaries, the church. So I don't think it shows residences, and I'm not a big expert on the history of Roxbury, but there is a history whose author I cannot think of right now. Maybe Mark or Bob can remind me who wrote the antiquarian history of Roxbury, and it might have a reference. Or go to the Leventhal Map Center online and look there under Roxbury and see what you can find.
Great, thank you. And let's see, here's one. I know John Bell is in the audience, but someone asked if the British troops marched on Mass Ave or on Somerville Ave.
Oh, John?
So I would ask John Bell to comment on that.
Yeah, I would like John to comment on that, because I don't know. And I said Mass Ave, and maybe that was wrong.
Well, okay. Well, while we're waiting for him, William DiGiacomontonio asks about how maps of pre-revolutionary Boston, whether they're published or in manuscript or more recent, compare in number, quality, circulation with maps or cartographic knowledge of other present-day cities. Do you have any sense of how is Boston better mapped or less?
There is a plethora of maps of Revolutionary era Boston because the British were here and because it was the seat of the war. There are many. I'm not an expert on that subject either, but I suspect that if you went to the Library of Congress list of maps of the Revolutionary War era, there would be a large number about Boston. And I really can't speak to, I don't have any sense about whether there's anything like that about Philadelphia or New York.
Yeah.
Do you know, Mark?
Okay.
Well, by the time Philadelphia and New York, Philadelphia especially, are starting to boom, there really is a lot of map making that goes on there. I've never tried to, compare the numbers, so I couldn't say one way or the other. But Boston certainly holds its own in that regard.
The Boston maps, I would say the era is really up through 1775, and then after that, after the British left, there are not as many, but there certainly were many done during the British period when the British were occupying it. And not just by Brits. I mean, there's some famous German maps, etc.
Yes. John Bell has responded that yes, it was Mass Ave that the British expedition marched on. And let's see, Dan Foley asks if we have any idea of how many Native Americans there were in the area in 1630. And that
No.
would either...
I would have to ask the author of that plate, who was Kate Grandjean, who's at Wellesley, unless someone else knows the answer.
Well, it sort of depends on where you're talking about, right? I mean, the Shawmut Peninsula proper was not a place of much in the way of native dwelling or population. The various regions to the southwest, the Great Blue Hill area, some to the north, and then down along the coast towards Plymouth is where there's a lot bigger native population at the time. But then again, all of this had suffered really dramatically before European colonization on a large scale began because of epidemics of various kinds.
Yeah. Yes. Let's see, here's one about Roxbury pudding stone. Dan Foley wants to know if it also can be found in Morocco from the time the North American plate abutted the African plate.
That's a good question. Because no, actually the part that became Boston came, I think, from the Antarctic. It was that plate, but it's been a while since I've written that. I'm sorry, but I don't think it came. I don't think it came from Morocco. I think it came from another place.
This is an astonishingly wide-ranging questions. Let's see, here are a couple from Steve Bortnick. One is about the Blackstone block. And is it true that this is the only remaining part of Boston that has not been changed? That is the streetscape in that area.
I couldn't say whether it's the only one, but it certainly is one. And it's very interesting. If you get to the center of the Blackstone block, you can actually look at the Ebenezer Hancock House, and you can see Marsh Lane and Salt Lane coming into the center there. And it does give you more of a sense of what it was like in the colonial period. But I would never say that it was the only place.
Well, I think I've told people that it is, so I will be a little more careful in the future.
All right. Okay. Well, I like it, but I didn't know it was the only one.
I think he's trying to fact check things he might have heard inadvertently from me. He has another one about, can we assume that no one cared about conservation or animal protection when they filled in waterways to make land, or did people just do what they wanted?
They certainly did not know about the importance of wetlands as we do now. I would say that, but the process did become regulated after 1866. I mean, there was a whole, you had to get permits, you actually had to pay in order to be able to fill. So beginning then, although not necessarily for the conservation reasons, it had to do with taking waterways that they thought might be useful for economic reasons, for shipping, for this kind of thing. But so I would say in terms of conservation, it's probably a fair assumption, but it has been regulated for quite some time.
That's true, and that's a subject you cover really very well in Gaining Ground. Here is one on pre-Civil War schools and literacy levels. And by pre-Civil War, I guess we could go back to the 1600s, and maybe Bob Anderson can comment, or Mark, if he's still with us, can comment.
No, I think Mark has had to leave.
Okay. So what about literacy levels in this area, or as opposed to other places?
I don't know.
My sense always is that it was higher here than in others because the Puritans did stress education and people did need to read the Bible. And then, of course, the first schools.
The first school, the first college, there was a lot of emphasis on education, and some of the first schools for girls actually
Yes.
in the 19th century were in Boston. But
Yes.
how that compared with the literacy levels elsewhere, I don't know. That's more for you than for me.
Okay, the Colonial Society's focus is 1815, and we know Horace Mann was doing his work in the 1830s, but that's a great subject about the history of education in New England. So I think that was most of the questions, and really thank you, Nancy, for this wonderful presentation. And the book is the historical.
Wait.
Yes.
Wait. I was supposed to show the book.
Yes.
So it's a great big oversized
Yes.
book. It's 11 by 14, and it's
Yes.
very reasonably priced. And I think you got the URL to order it from the University of Chicago Press with a 20% discount if you'd like. But I think it's a real bargain.
It is. Now, how would people get the 20% discount?
It was supposed to have been listed. I sent the whole thing to Mary, both the URL and the discount information. So it was supposed to have been posted.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Bob, for joining us and for pitching in and your work on the Atlas. And again, as Mark said, it really is a tremendous work, and both it's going to be an enduring book that people will enjoy for years to come. It really sets a standard, I think, for scholarship and for the fact that you brought all of these scholars together to contribute to this terrific book. So thank you.
Well, thank you for all your work too. I mean, I certainly couldn't do it by myself. That was the whole point.
So thank you, Nancy, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon with the Colonial Society of Massachusetts State